Tomorrow at 11 a.m., we will pause to remember an event that no living person can remember. It happened 106 years ago. There are like 500,000 people alive over the age of 100, and only a fraction of them would be over 106. And of course, none would be old enough to have been aware of what happened on November the 11th, 1918. But what happened on that day? That was the day when the bombing and the shooting and the killing stopped after the most devastating war this world had ever seen. And I don't think any of us could possibly imagine the feeling of relief that swept over people as the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month tolled, and the fronts that had been filled with so much death finally fell silent. And it is odd, I suppose, in some ways, that we still observe an armistice that no one can remember. And I realize, of course, that part of the meaning of that is because the meaning of the day has been transformed to become a day when we remember those who served in many wars since the war to end all wars. And it has become a day when we pray and we work for peace. But I also think it's significant that we celebrate that particular armistice and the Treaty of Versailles that codified the peace about a year later. Because here's the thing, treaties matter. The treaties of the past, I would actually say, have had more influence on the shape of this world even than the wars. And that is true, certainly for the Treaty of Versailles, which, of course, was not particularly successful at ending all wars. Treaties matter, and so I suggest that we ignore them to our peril. And so I would actually like to tell you about a treaty that you may never have heard of, but that in some sense I think we're all called to honor. When the European settlers first came to this area, they found it, of course, already inhabited. This did not prevent them from claiming the land as their own possession. They had this false doctrine, the doctrine of discovery, that allowed them to dismiss the inhabitants here as mere savages. But their first concern was not merely the possession of more than a few bits of the land. No, their first concern was the goal of much of Western civilization: profit. And they saw the indigenous people who lived here as a useful tool for driving that profit. They persuaded the indigenous people to go out and use their considerable skills to extract resources from the wilderness around here. Most valuable being, of course, the furs and the pelts. This strategy of wealth production was enormously successful. It was most successful, as always, for the European investors. But the indigenous people also did pretty well and were able to gain valuable trade goods, at least at first. But, as often happens, problems began to crop up. In the beginning, the resources were abundant, but the relentless drive for profit began to see those resources dry up. Some species were pushed into extinction in accessible regions, and people were forced to hunt and to trap further and further afield. It also pushed the First Nations into competition with each other, and that led to environmental destruction and war between the nations. Now, we are generally not very aware of these fur wars. The settler colonialists weren't directly involved, but like all wars, this one was devastating, both to the people and to the environment, and the need for peace for all those involved became urgent. That is part of the history of this place, right here where we are sitting. Well, you're sitting, I'm standing, but you get the idea. And there's one thing that particularly strikes me about that history this morning, because it parallels something in our reading this morning from the book of Genesis. Our passage from Genesis tells the story of two men who have come to Canaan from far off Mesopotamia. Their names are Abram and Lot. And like the colonists who came to this place, they came to Canaan to get rich. And they measured their wealth in terms of herds and cattle instead of furs. But apart from that, it's pretty much the same old story. And just like happened here, Abram and Lot didn't do the manual labor themselves. No, they hired the local indigenous people to be their herders. The story mentions about how, when it's talking about problems among their workforce, that at that time the Canaanites and Perizzites lived in their lands. This would have provided their workforce. But there was a problem. And it is the same problem that often arises in the relentless pursuit of ever-growing profits. The Bible puts the problem like this: the land could not support both of them living together because their possessions were so great. See, when we relentlessly pursue profit, the result is often that the land cannot bear us. Natural resources are stretched. This has devastating effects on the land. In their cases, the resources that were being stretched were not beaver and bison pelts, but things like groundwater and grazing land. But apart from that, yes, the story's the same. A story as old as time. And what was the result in old Canaan? Well, the same thing that happened here. Strife and conflict. Not between the wealthy, but amongst those who were working for them. Thus, strife arose between the herders of Abram's livestock and the herders of Lot's livestock. Now, to Abram and Lot's credit, they recognized that this was a problem. Though they themselves were not the ones suffering, they decided to fix the problem, and did so, of course, by creating a treaty between the two of them. Now, it wasn't really a treaty that solved the root problem, because what they did was they decided to separate so they could continue to relentlessly exploit the land, but at least they did something to alleviate the suffering among their indigenous workforce. Things didn't quite work out exactly the same in this area. Apparently, the lords of the fur trade didn't mind strife among the First Nations who were providing them with their furs. As good capitalists, I guess, they thought that the competition would be good for the bottom line, and so the strife continued, deepened, and spread. In this very area, the Mississaugas, an Anishinaabe nation, were pushed out of their traditional territories by the Haudenosaunee, and they fled north and west. And then a few years later, they returned in alliance with the Odawa and the Chippewa. And it seemed as if open war with the Haudenosaunee was inevitable. War that would quickly spread and be devastating to all indigenous nations. But wisdom prevailed, and a treaty was made. Now, this treaty was not created by the wealthy companies like what happened in Canaan. They, in fact, didn't like the idea of a treaty, never recognized it. No, the First Nations understood that they would have to make their own peace. And they did so. They did so according to an ancient indigenous concept: a dish with one spoon. Now, there is evidence that this idea of a dish with one spoon may be as old as 1,000 years. It's one of the foundational concepts that governs indigenous people's relationship with the land. And I'm not indigenous, and I certainly would not presume to speak for them. And in fact, I would love to hear more from Native elders about this treaty someday. But I will share with you my pretty basic understanding. They see the land as being like a dish, in the sense that the land produces food, resources to feed and support people and animals, and everyone can share in that bounty. But they also recognize that if everyone takes from the dish without limit, especially in pursuit of profit above all, that this will not be sustainable. The dish will give out. And that's where the one spoon comes in. So instead of everyone eating with their own spoon at their own pace, consumption needs to be limited by the need to share one spoon. Pretty simple concept, of course, but powerful and very important and foundational to how indigenous people lived on this land. And so the First Nations made a treaty, which they called, fittingly, a dish with one spoon. This treaty was formally adopted in Montreal in September of 1700. They did not sign the treaty in European fashion, of course. Instead, it was solemnized in the traditional fashion by the creation and presentation of a wampum belt. But even if the treaty was adopted in Montreal, it changed everything here, right here. It brought peace. As part of this treaty, the Mississaugas, who had claimed this land since time immemorial, agreed to give up the land, to give up their exclusive land on the claim on the land, to share it with all nations according to the law of a dish with one spoon. Now, the world has changed a whole lot since 1700. 100 years later, this land, right here, was given away by the British Crown to the Iroquois of the Six Nations, a Haudenosaunee people, as part of the treaty of another war, the War of 1812. Now, the Crown did not own this land. It had been shared with all by the Mississaugas in the previous treaty, but apparently the Crown was not overly concerned with that and gave the land away. Have you ever thought about that? The incredible history of various people living on this land, relating to this land, where we have houses, where we work and live our lives. And these treaties are an important part of our history. I know that we often think of treaties as applying only to indigenous people. I mean, their ancestors entered these treaties, so therefore they are still bound by them. But our ancestors entered them as well. Are we not also bound by them? If we live on land that has been shared or given by treaty, is there not some sense in which we ought to live according to that treaty, or at least according to the spirit of that treaty? And I know that our history on this land, in this place, has made that question pretty complicated, especially the part when our ancestors did not actually keep the treaties that they made. But I think there are important lessons that we ought to take to heart from the story of the treaty between Abram and Lot and the story of the treaty of a dish with one spoon. Let these treaties remind us that our relationship with the land that we live on is fragile. And if we exploit it in ways that forget the ideal of a dish with one spoon, if our only concern is a relentless pursuit of profit, we may find, like those two patriarchs did, that the land cannot support us. And the result will lead to conflict and suffering. And who will suffer? Will it be Abram? Will it be Lot? Will it be the wealthy fur barons? No. Don't worry about them. They're going to be fine. No, it'll be the people of the land who suffer, the herders, the indigenous nations, the low-wage workers, ultimately, really, the majority of people. I do hope that the stresses that we continue to put on the land in our relentless pursuit of profit do not lead to new conflicts or a need for new treaties. But they could. It's happened before. Perhaps we could avoid that eventuality by deciding to learn from the biblical treaty between Abram and Lot, and by learning from the treaty that saved this land from becoming a field of slaughter 300 years ago, teaching us that the land is a dish and that we can all share with one spoon. Lord, grant us peace in this land, respect for it, and respect for all peoples. And let us not forget those who were here first. Amen.